Greetings, Grammarpaloozians. I'm Mignon Fogarty, and I'm here with Natan Last, author of Across the Universe, this just wonderful book about crossword puzzles, the whole cross world, as they call it. And in the main section, we talked about, using computers to construct crosswords. We have like fun tidbits about Will Shortz and his crossword patterned pajama bottoms. But in this, we're going to talk about the early history of crossword puzzles. And Natan, welcome to the bonus section for the Grammarpaloozians.
Thanks. I'm excited for bonus content.
Bonus content, yes. So the first thing that surprised me is that they originally were not called crossword puzzles. They were called word cross puzzles. What happened there?
That's right. Yeah, they were Arthur Wynne, the editor of the fun section of the New York World in 1913. He had this idea for the word cross puzzle, and there was a hyphen, word hyphen cross. And this was a big task for the typesetters. So all the clues would be hand typeset, the grid would be hand inked, and the title would be inked as well. And the typesetters who just were overwhelmed one day spun it on the axis of that hyphen, and the crossword was born.
Yeah, I never thought of that. But like by hand, it would be tough to lay out a crossword puzzle in a paper.
Yeah, it's super, super tricky. The early, for folks who really like comics, Ernie Bushmiller Jr., who drew Nancy, was one of the very first crossword inkers, right? He was in the art department of the New York World. And they weren't just black and white in the early teens and 20s. He would like do a ye old woodcut finish. He would do peppermint sort of stripes in the black squares. He would really kind of zhuzh it up back in the day before things were fully standardized.
Yeah, was he doing that by hand?
Yeah, you'd hand ink them and then send them to the printer, yeah.
Wow. So another thing that cracked me up is that nobody thought they were going to be a big hit. Nobody thought they were going to last.
That's right, yeah. Arthur Wynne actually tried to patent the puzzle. And there's two businessmen up at New York World who just think this is a flash in the pan. This is not going to last. And so they declined to cough up the patent fee, which would have been like $75 at the time, a couple thousand today. And so because of their kind of incorrect forecast, the crossword, remains open to all.
Yeah, that's great. And there was also such negativity toward it. Like it just shocking. Like what was people's problem with crossword puzzles?
Yeah, there's this in 1925. There's an op-ed in the Times called "A Familiar Form of Badness," and it's the sense that crosswords are fake intellectualism, right? You have at the same time people saying, if you want to learn words, go read Shakespeare. And that piece in the Times, is worried about leisure fads that have taken hold of the young in America. It's the jazz age. America is for the first time experiencing leisure time, right? The way the industrialization that occurs in World War I just totally reconfigures everyone's day. And also the way that after World War I, for the first time, America has fought on the world stage and comes home and sort of psychologically transmits some of that interest in fighting to these frivolous competitions. So there's yo-yoing contests, beauty pageants are invented at this time. People, see who can sit atop a flagpole for longest, right? There's like who can dance the longest. And all of this competitiveness gets channeled into games. And the sort of old guard at this time just thinks, last year it was Mahjong. This year it's crosswords. What will the youth kind of waste their time on? It's also a thing that, the early innovators of the crossword were all women. And in an age of, flappers and kind of a new societal sense of sexuality, this idea that women are turning their intellectual attention to something that is about being smart, but also a frivolous game, really, I think, stirred up a lot of anger.
That's fascinating. Yeah, because today I think people say, do crossword puzzles to keep your brain sharp, and it's viewed very much as an intellectual pursuit. I couldn't believe that libraries banned them.
Yeah. No, that there's a quote where these institutions claimed a right to defend themselves, right, and their serious patrons from unseriousness. So puzzle fans are swarming the dictionary. And they're using the dictionary and the newspapers in the library to solve puzzles instead of doing something serious like reading the day's headlines. So libraries ended up being this like protective caste, very angry at the crossword craze.
Amazing. I mean, today, I think libraries would be so excited if people were coming in and looking things up in the
Yeah,
dictionary, in the encyclopedia, like, oh my gosh, someone's using them. That's wonderful.
totally.
And you said that a lot of the did a lot of the criticism come from Britain? And is this war related?
Yeah, it's definitely, there's this good cultural historian who talks about crosswords being really popular in 1920s America because they're at the cultural crossroads of Victorianism and modernism. And so you have these old Victorian mores of steadfastness and knowledge that are kind of being used in the crossword. We're asking for knowledge, but also it's this very frivolous, punny, cutesy game. And so you just get this tutting that comes from the UK that is just a little bit more culturally conservative at the time, uh, in the aftermath of the war, and writes an article. There's an article in the London Times in 1924 that's titled "An Enslaved America," and they're tallying up the number of hours lost to productive work, to labor, because people are solving puzzles instead of doing their jobs, supposedly. And they make some quip like puzzles are worse than unions or something like that.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, people are really mad.
Yeah. I mean, I can imagine today, like, I don't know, like the hustle bros being like, don't waste your time on crossword. I mean, it has that same vibe. Like, you aren't working hard enough.
That's right. That's right. And I think there's a really interesting thing where, there's all of this wonderful ephemera from the 20s of people at their jobs kind of ignoring what they ought to be doing, at least as far as their employers are concerned, and instead solving a crossword. And so it is this image. This is true throughout the entire century. Puzzles have been popular. That it has the vibe of a shirker, right? And you're sort of proudly not doing what you're supposed to be doing, but you're doing it in a way that expresses that you're smart and that you're worldly. And so it's got those two interesting angles to it, for sure.
Yeah. I mean, I do have that problem. I somewhat relate because, I started doing puzzles and then doing more and more puzzles. And then I discovered this site that has puzzles and that site that has puzzles. And I looked up and I was spending like 2 hours a day doing word puzzles. And I'm like, okay,
Yeah,
I need to dial it back like a little bit.
definitely. No, it's really hard. I mean, I have a lot of friends who have to get through, Wordle and spelling bee and so on before they start their day. And I'm actually not as disciplined as that. I sort of solve puzzles whenever the mood strikes, but people really make a routine of it.
Yeah, absolutely, you can. And so, so World War One was sort of what boosted, it was after World War One when people had all this free time and maybe were embracing frivolity that puzzles started. And then World War Two, like another war, seemed to like boost them even more.
Yeah, I think it is because crosswords have this feel of forward progress, but also are a frivolous game, that they end up really becoming important in moments of crisis. And so the New York Times in particular does not acquiesce to the crossword craze, right? So puzzles are invented in 1913 at the New York World. There's that big craze in the 20s. And then it isn't until World War II that the Times says, I think we're going to need something after Pearl Harbor to sort of quiet the home front, right? There are about to be blackout hours. It's going to be a pretty bleak national moment. A distraction could be useful. And so the Times hires Margaret Farrar, who had been the brains and brawn behind the first crossword puzzle book in 1924, to be their inaugural editor, switching from, their line before had been without the New York Times, without comics, without puzzles, strictly a newspaper. And I kind of love both senses of the word strict there, where they're like sort of knuckle rapping in their strictness as well.
Yeah. No, I was really surprised that it was such a like conscious reaction to World War II. And then even though it was supposed to be a diversion, like the puzzle, it seems like was actually quite political often during that time.
Yeah, no, there's a constructor named John Farmer who helped digitize a lot of the puzzles from that Margaret Farrar era, so the early days of the New York Times puzzle. And he has a quip that goes something like, Margaret Farrar practically enlisted the New York Times crossword in the Allied war effort, right? Because, there'll be clues like, he thinks he can get along with Hitler for the word appeaser,
Mhm.
or the Atlantic Ocean, Atlantic will be clued as junkyard for Nazi subs. And it's this like real like squaring up kind of vibe for a game that we think of as encyclopedic, as dispassionate, as purely just feeding you uh, straight up facts. When in fact, the New York Times in 1942, who could blame them, can't do anything but talk about the war that was so all encompassing.
Yeah, it's still on everyone's mind. And you mentioned the pandemic earlier. Like, yeah, during the lockdown phase of the pandemic, uh, crossword puzzles and all word games got another huge boost.
Yeah, it really, really, really. I think Wordle is a huge anchor point here. The philosopher of games, C.T. Nguyen, who I quote a lot in the book, talks about Wordle's narrative nature. So it's not just that you solve a game every day; it's that you send everyone in the group chat or on Twitter that 5x6 grid of green and yellow and gray that is a picture of how you struggled from beginning guessing to the end, hopefully victory. And that communal and that narrative aspect, I think, was really helpful for people who in lockdown felt really unmoored, both in the spatial sense, they're stuck at home, but also in time, right? Temporally, there's not a lot going on. Each day looks like the next and the last. And so something like the crossword streak, where you just have this sense of forward progress. I've done the puzzle 100 days in a row. I've gotten faster at solving Mondays 3 months in a row. That sense of forward progress, of intellectual accomplishment in a moment when not much is happening. And for those of us with stressful jobs, we feel like we're sort of being sacrificed at the altar of productivity. Being productive in a non-productive game, I think, was a balm for a lot of people.
Yeah, and it really brought people together. I was on a Slack, and even when I didn't have something to say every day, it was nice to just check in and post my puzzle and say, like, I'm still here.
Totally. No, I mean, the way that, Wordle group chats have brought, aunts and nieces and nephews and people who are further flung in their family units than usually talk, it really has brought a lot of people together in a way that is just a good thing, I think.
Yeah. Was it during lockdown? There was a wonderful story in your book about two siblings who did crosswords together. I think it was crosswords when their mother was sick. Was that during lockdown?
Yeah, so I
Oh.
tell the story of, Ben and Hadass Reich, who uh, are siblings, and their mother is diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, and they kind of rush home, and in the hospital, Ben actually hooks up his, laptop to the big TV screen, and he and his sister solve the puzzle, and their mother is sort of watching them collaborate. It's this really wonderful moment for her. She helps when she's sort of well enough, and they kind of make it a ritual to solve it every day. And she does unfortunately pass away from the cancer, and they end up quarantining because COVID happens at this time, for something like a year and a half in their childhood home, right? Which is now in a somber reversal of the empty nest. It's kind of she's gone, but they're still there. And the crossword, because it began as a streak when they were with her in the hospital room, there's a sense that if they can just keep doing it every day, it kind of keeps her memory alive. And in fact, the first day of lockdown in which they're able to kind of uh, kick loose a little bit. They go to a friend who owns a bar, and there's like a bit of a goodbye because someone's moving. Uh, the bar's empty of other patrons. Hadass hadn't had a margarita in months or whatever, and they have a good time. They come home, they go to bed, they wake up, and they realize that they hadn't solved the puzzle that day. And so this kind of streak has been broken. The incantation has been muted, and it's really, really sad. They sort of break down in tears. In a funny way, they end up they do the puzzle and they email the Times. And the Times is sort of happy to reinstate the streak.
I took pity on them.
Yeah, you can kind of call the manager a little bit on that one. But it just ends up being this really beautiful way of like marking time, of remembering their mother, of becoming closer as siblings, and working through a dark moment. So the puzzle has all these sorts of salutary and like intimate aspects that I think get a little underrated because it is this knowledge game, but it has these softer aspects too.
Yeah, very cool. Well, the book is called Across the Universe. Oh, in books, we have to do your book recommendations. So, we want people to go get your book, Across the Universe, and honestly, it would make just a wonderful gift for anyone who does crossword puzzles. But after you finish Across the Universe, what are some of the books that you recommend? What do you buy for gifts for people, or what are books that have stayed with you over the years?
Yeah, no, I love this question. I'm also I write crosswords and I write prose and poetry as well, and so I like to give one recommendation kind of each type. So I love recommending poetry. One of my favorite books of poems of all time is Lighthead by Terrence Hayes, which is just really playful with language. It's like really sonic. It's got a sort of hip hop energy to it, but it's also very tender. And I think for people who don't read a lot of poetry, it can be a really fun and exciting entry point
Hmm.
to poetry. For nonfiction, I recently reread What We Talk About When We Talk About Books, which is Here by Leah Price, and it's really really wonderful. It's just like a really great. She's a book historian, but it's just a wonderful history of the book as an object.
Hmm.
So taking us all the way back from indulgences, right, single page Catholic Church produced texts, to the very first audiobooks, which is to say, uh, you know, 12-year-olds working in a factory getting read to,
Hmm.
right? And the way that we have this sense of distraction, which was also something levied at physical books because everyone was used to orality at the time. And so it's this really wonderful history that I think like breaks us away from a lot of the sort of anger we have about distraction in reading. It was sort of affirming to read that some of these debates are centuries old. Uh, and then for fiction, again, another recent reread, but for me in this, AI era of like bullet points and lifeless prose, I end up turning to novelists who are really pyrotechnic and wonderful at the sentence level. And so I recently reread Pnin by Vladimir Nabokov, and it's just so fun word by word and so crackling with uh, personality. And I feel like every single sentence I learn a new word. And it really made me it was a breath of fresh air given some of the stuff we have to read today.
Yeah. Yeah, and, like, one little tidbit in your book that I didn't think we'd get to, but that was so fascinating, and now we can, is that Nabokov, he had synesthesia. Like
Yeah. Yeah, he had grapheme color synesthesia and like sees all these different letters as different colors. And of course, he describes it beautifully. He talks about O's as I think being like uh which I think that one is like rolled oats or something. And he talks about R's as vulcanized rubber. So he like uses his own wonderful powers of description to bring us into what he sees, which is a wonderful grapheme color synesthesia.
yeah, and just thinking about how that would affect the way you view words and how you write, and then he married a woman who had synesthesia, and their son has synesthesia, so that was, like, the whole family, but they saw things in different ways though, right? If I remember right?
Yeah. I think he sees sort of I think it's M's as like blue and she sees them as red. And I think, their son Dimitri ends up seeing it as purple. So it's like beautiful, you get the palette of the two parents and the colors are mixed.
That was mind-blowing, and actually, I tried to see if there were other famous authors who had synesthesia after I read that in your book, and I couldn't find there aren't any that are as well known, at least as he is, and, yeah, I was bummed because I was hoping that there were a whole bunch of them, and I wanted to, like, do a big roundup about it, but, like, there weren't.
Yeah, I'll let you know if I can think of any others. I mean, his really like just shines through, as you're saying, in his prose for sure.
Cool. Awesome. Well, thank you, Natan. Natan Last, author of Across the Universe, this fabulous book about crossword puzzles. Where can people find you?
My website is natanlast.com and Natan Last on all of the socials, so Instagram and X and so on. And yeah, this was
Yeah.
wonderful.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.